So listening, right, is about making meaning from sensory information. I think the group did a great job of differentiating what it means to hear something in a sensory way versus what it means to listen. So you can think about hearing as just the sounds and the very physical sensation of, your ear picking up on or like physically getting that stimuli, right? So you hear a word, like you hear the word dog, the physical sound that's entering your ears is hearing. Listening, again, is much more about how we're making sense of and figuring out that meaning. And so this model of these different stages of listening is a really important way for us to understand how and why we choose to listen and listen to some things over others. One thing that's especially true over the past several years is that there is significantly more noise in the world. I don't just mean that in terms of like physical sounds like traffic, but I also mean that in terms of the amount of stimuli that we're bombarded with every day, right? You can think about even over the course of a morning, what's going on. Your alarm is going off, you're hearing trains in the background, you browse social media, and there's tons of advertisements. Maybe there's an advertisement that pops up, starts playing audio when you don't want it to. You turn on the radio, and the radio has a ton of information and advertisements and so on. So what that means, given the sheer amount of information that we're exposed to in a world of new media, technology, and so on, is that in order to survive, we have to make decisions about what information we're choosing to listen to and what is just kind of sounds that we hear. Yeah, guys.
What is the step 3?
Step 3 is remembering. Yeah, so our ability to understand and engage in information for later. So, right, that whole process of getting so much information every day means that we inevitably are going to have to just hear information and not really make sense of it or view it as significant, right? If we paid attention to every single random advertisement that we see every day, like we see a commercial, right? If we did that all the time, our brains would be pretty overloaded by the end. So in many ways, what we choose to hear versus what we choose to listen to is a means of survival. And oftentimes means we're put in situations where we have to really mentally adjust to listen to and make sense of things that other people have to say, right? When we're exhausted and overstretched and overstimulated, as I know many of us might feel about a month into the quarter, that can raise some serious challenges in terms of listening. So I think the group did a great job of going over these 6 stages. So I'm not going to go over them in super exhaustive detail. Just to say, right, hearing is this very sensory physiological process. Understanding goes to this idea of decoding, right? So you might think about the transactional model of communication where information is encoded. We use language and symbols to kind of upload. Decoding is downloading. So understanding the process of downloading the message. So if somebody says, my dog ran away today, you can understand that maybe they're upset and concerned. Remembering, right, is that we know the message later. So unlike a TV commercial or ad, right, this is something that we view as meaningful enough that we will come back to that later. Something like a name, right, is especially hard to remember because early on when we're getting to know somebody, we're trying to differentiate hearing a name versus listening to a name, as it's said, to better understand. Interpreting, right, is about thinking about context, right? So we've talked a lot about different language choices and about how the importance of context is a really big factor of how we communicate. You might also think about the difference between low and high context cultures. High context cultures have a lot of subtext and little details about their communication that shape the way that they engage with each other. So context is about understanding why it is that somebody's saying what they are. Maybe they're saying, hey, my dog went missing, can you help me find them? And that's the implication there. So evaluating, right, is judging the message. So evaluating is something important for us, especially as we are exposed to a lot of information every day, some that might be more accurate or fact-driven than others, right? So especially as we come across information that might be misleading or false, including false information on things like social media, evaluating is important for us to understand and judge that message. And responding, right, Responding essentially involves the use of feedback, so we can respond verbally. We can also respond through kind of these physiological responses like nodding, using things like yes, I understand, I see. Those types of things allow us to convey to the other person that the message has been received. And that's something we choose to do a lot in communication, because if we value the relationship and conversation we're having with somebody else, we want to show them that we're paying attention and we understand what they have to say. Restating what somebody says in your own words is a really good and common way that will show that we're engaged in active listening and that we care. So these steps, I think, are important ways to think about the listening process. Again, listening is different from hearing or the physical way that we pick up on information. Listening is this cognitive step of really engaging in the message and responding to that message. I also think the group did a great job of describing this taxonomy of listening. So I want to go over this type of model again in a little bit more detail. Right, so discriminative, comprehensive, and then these sort of therapeutic, critical, and appreciative approaches here on the top. This is another pyramid that we're using in the class. Once again, I promise this class is not a pyramid scheme. So these different models of the pyramid are ways of us understanding the level of complexity that we do in our listening, right? So the higher the level, the more kind of higher level or engaged our listening style is. So discriminative listening is involving picking out and understanding the message, right? It's our ability to discriminate or to pick up on the message as it stands out from the crowd. So if you were participating in the kind of telephone thing at the end of the discussion leading, you were trying to discriminate the message that you and that other person had from the other conversations happening in the class, right? It's your ability to pick up on that message as distinct or unique. At this comprehensive messaging and listening level, we're better understanding the message in a full way. In other words, we're gaining a really full, developed understanding of what the other person has to say. So maybe they're telling us the story of how their dog got lost. They're talking about how they woke up in the morning, they opened the yard as they did, then they saw the fence was open, and they're using all of that information to make sense of the story and figure out what to do, right? So the difference between comprehensive and discriminative is that while discriminative is picking it out of the crowd, comprehensive is about getting the full story and getting as many details as you can right. That's especially a time when we might recall information and kind of paraphrase back to somebody else. So the therapeutic, critical, and appreciative approaches are listed here at the top, right? Therapeutic is this idea of being a sounding board for somebody else, or really allowing yourself to listen and engage in order to know what that person is going through or dealing with. You might think back to last class when I mentioned that as you get to know and have felt more comfortable with somebody else through greater self-disclosure, we're more likely to have kind of asymmetrical conversations, right? Where somebody is talking more than somebody else. That's oftentimes because when you know and trust somebody pretty well, someone might be more comfortable to self-disclosing a lot of information and saying, you know, here's this story about how I took this exam and it was really hard and I came in late and I couldn't get my grade changed. And maybe they're talking about that story, right? So a therapeutic approach is oftentimes this higher level of listening we do in our close relationships with other people because we trust the person enough to take the time to get to know them. Additionally, a critical approach, right? So critical thinking and critical listening is about really examining the message and the way that things such as power, influence, and control are shaping the message that we have every day. So if you're a critical thinker or a critical listener, you're really paying attention to the factual elements of what that person has to say. So, for instance, if you're watching something like a political debate or a candidate or president speak, and you might find yourself skeptical or disagreeing with a lot of their message, you might look at the factual claims that they make and sort of think about that carefully. One thing that's really kind of interesting is that a lot of kind of journalists will put out after a major speech from like a world leader like the president, they'll put out kind of the transcript of the speech, and then they'll identify certain parts to assess whether or not those things are factually correct. And that's a really good example of using that critical thinking and listening approach, because it's not only recalling the message, but it's saying, what about this is correct, what isn't? If you've ever played Two Truths and a Lie, where you either have some true and factual information or some information that's just incorrect, right? That's a fun way of using the critical approach. You're trying to figure out and make sense of what messages are true or false. And then appreciative, right, is this idea of really just enjoying and taking in the message. It's not just that it's on in the background, it's that we're actively understanding that message and we really find it meaningful to us. So if you're involved in a religious or spiritual group, right, and there's something like a service or a speaker, and you appreciate their message, right, you agree with what they have to say and you feel that it's insightful and important to you, that's an example of using that type of appreciative listening. So kind of these upper levels are really actively involving our brain and our engagement on the messages that we get every day. So I think that the group members did a great job of talking about these 4 different types of listening styles. I want to get into these in a little bit more detail, including an activity that I'll ask you to do that integrates these different styles of listening. But the 4 different listening styles are in many ways based on things such as culture and are also informed by many things like our goals. There's also a lot of ways things such as gender can play into how we choose to engage in listening with other people, right? People-focused listeners are ones that are really concerned with the other person and with kind of the overall behavior, the patterns, and so on that person has. So in particular, somebody such as a therapist or counselor is going to take on, at times, a very people-oriented style. They're not just listening to the words that you have to say, but they're picking up on things such as your emotions, your facial expressions, your feelings, and so on. In other words, a lot of people-oriented listeners are not as concerned with the content of the messages so much as the overall feelings and ideas that are being shared among people. You can think back, the way that things such as nonverbal communication play a huge role in how we message with each other, right? I posed a challenge to you a few weeks earlier about how you could watch a show in a different language with no subtitles or captions, and you can still understand a lot of the message because the people-oriented elements, their expressions, their nonverbal communication, say a lot about what they're trying to communicate. People-oriented listeners will oftentimes check in, right, and say, how are you doing? You seem stressed out. It seems like it's really bothering you, right? The classic, therapy question, how does that make you feel? It's an example of using a people-oriented listening style. Action listeners are very much focused on what do you want, right? What does that other person desire out of the relationship or out of their communication? What is the goal here? If you've ever heard the phrase or have had the phrase used on you, cut to the chase, that's an example, right, of getting to the point or to really talk about the goal of that communication. So action-oriented listeners might be people such as supervisors or bosses who don't necessarily have a lot of time and really value that direct form of communication. Content. So content-oriented listeners are people that really like digging into and understanding the message itself, right? So a content-oriented listener might be somebody that is really interested in something such as, a guest lecture or colloquium presentation or something that somebody's speaking and talking about a topic. And so oftentimes for something like a presentation or, some sort of invited guest to EOU, we're not necessarily super interested in them as a person. We're interested in their project, their research, their ideas, and the things that they bring to the table. So we might use a content-oriented listening style there. Lastly, time-oriented listeners, right, are very much concerned with how we manage and use our time effectively. These are people that will say, hey, I've got 5 minutes, let's talk for a bit, we need to wrap this up and get going. These are the kinds of listeners who constantly think about the way that time is playing into the relationship. Again, these things are deeply tied to both gender and to culture, right? For instance, in terms of gender, men are more likely to be action-oriented or content-oriented listeners, and women might be more likely to be people-oriented listeners. And that's oftentimes a product of culture over time, right, in terms of how folks, including men and women, might be socialized or raised to focus on different elements of our communication. And as a result, right, challenges and ambiguity in communication can come when people from different genders and perspectives are looking for different things out of the listening process. Additionally, culture plays a really big role. You can think about our time orientation and its relationship to culture. So, for instance, a lot of countries such as the United States are very focused and future-oriented. Things such as being punctual, being on time, are seen in a very kind of rigid way, arrive right at this time. Whereas in a lot of other cultures, time might be more flexible. It's maybe more normal to be late for things. And so our orientation to time can shape how important that is as an aspect of our own listening. There's also these different types of listening, right? So for instance, silent listening, right, is you're just hearing what's being said and processing that for yourself. You might be questioning or better understanding. Hey, so you said you lost your dog. Where did you last see them? So questioning can help to clarify or better understand the issue. Paraphrasing, again, is a really helpful strategy. Tell me what I told you. Empathizing, right, is, again, the Atticus Finch, put yourself in somebody else's shoes to better understand that person. Supporting is showing, hey, I understand you're going through a difficult time. It's providing that level of feedback that shows that you care about them. Analyzing, right, a content-oriented listener is really interested in analyzing, about making sense of the message. So, what can we do to help you with finding your dog? Evaluating is figuring out the best thing to do. From what you've told me, it sounds like we need to get in touch with animal control about what we need to do going forward. Again, content-oriented listeners are really concerned with this. And then advising might be offering direct information. Here, I have the number for animal control so that you can get in touch with them. So these different kinds of listening are very context dependent, right? Something that we oftentimes experience, including on the basis of gender, is whether or not somebody would like to receive advice or this type of information in response to something. Sometimes people just want to vent, right? And better understanding what it is that somebody is seeking from their communication and from what they want listened to is important in order to better support that person. Oftentimes, a lot of conflicts, including conflicts among romantic partners, emerge because there's a disconnect in the communication and the goals of that communication. So somebody wants to be listened to, but doesn't necessarily want a solution right away because they want to feel heard and understood. So what I'd like you to do is, you can write or type this, but based on the 4 listening styles, which do you think best describes you? Either people-oriented, action, content, or time. You might use a sentence or two to explain why you feel like you fit under this listening style the best. And then think about these different kinds of listening that we've talked about in the class, and then maybe think about which of these types that you've used the most. So give you a little bit of time on your own to work through this.